Stalin's camps return to Putin's Russia. The hint of a new Gulag Archipelago takes shape. Remember the Gulag? That grim and terrifying institution of forced labor, mass arrests, and industrial scale death that Stalin used to apparently modernize Russia. It wasn't just camps, it was terror. Ideology turned into watchtowers and razor wire, and millions of lives drained into Russia's unforgiving soil for what seemed like capricious and measly ends. Above all, the Gulag was a mindset of grinding horror for those incarcerated and terror for those threatened with incarceration, but it also served as a projection of power for the Russian state on the international stage. The regime was basically saying, look at the horrors we are prepared to inflict on our own people. Imagine if we are capable of this, then what we can do to you and your loved ones. This is where so many people get Russia's rulers wrong, right down to Putin in the present day. Russia's power, its existence does not come from the exercise of raw power, because in monetary terms and in most meaningful indices that denote powerful countries, Russia trails far, far behind. No, Russia's power, its sense of worth, its status, its very existence comes from the idea that it is feared. If Russia is not feared, Putin believes, and has hinted at this many times in his speeches, then it is not. To be feared is to exist, and to be ignored and not feared, that is the real existential threat to Putin, and by extension, all of Russia. Fast forward, since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia has begun moving dangerously towards Gulag 2.0. In June 2025, analysts Andrei Soldatov and Irina Bragan reported that Russia's FSB is working to build a new Gulag. Echoes of the Stalinist era may mark the moment the country returns to the status of an unashamed dictatorship. That was written in SIPA. Under new legislation passed by a rubber-stamped Duma, the FSB is preparing to reclaim its own pre-trial detention centres, historically the hub of Stalin's brutal purges, as reported in Meduza. According to the explanatory note, this is because, with the beginning of the special military operation, the number of suspects has increased significantly, again from SIPA. In other words, Ukraine's invasion is Putin's shortcut to purges. The KGB's heirs are rearming for domestic sweeps of enemies. The authoritarian drift since 2012 has accelerated in wartime, but this isn't spontaneous. The authoritarian slide began in 2012 with law after law and lawless act after lawless act, with many leading opposition figures subdued in the process. The war hasn't created authoritarianism, but it has amplified it. In 2012, we had the foreign agent laws that targeted NGOs that shine light on both Soviet-era repression, but also current lawless acts by the Russian government. In 2021, Memorial, the human rights group, was dissolved, their archives confiscated, according to The Economist. 2022 onwards, dissenters jailed under new wartime laws, 13,000 prosecutions so far. This is according to Project. The Gulag Museum's closure is another inflection point, but this curve of persecution began years before. Each year, more control, less nuance and complexity allowable in the retelling of history. They say history is written by the winners, but in Russia, it's written by bullies and tyrants, often to cover up failure and losses. The Gulag History Museum, Memory Under Siege. There was one place keeping the memory alive, Moscow's Gulag History Museum, founded in 2001 by dissident Anton Antonovich Ovsienko. It won the Council of Europe's Museum Prize in 2021, reported by The Guardian. It displayed primary documents, testimonies, and even art and theatre related to the camps. Then came November the 14th, 2024. The decision to temporarily suspend the activities of the State Gulag Museum was taken for fire safety reasons, fire safety violations. Yes, The Guardian reported that, but sure, except that inspectors hadn't flagged those issues before, and critics say that it is no coincidence. In the 1990s, using fire safety regulation was a classic tool used to shake down companies and extort money, bribes, and create enormous grift by corrupt officials in the quasi-mafia run state and local authorities. Similar organization says Medusa came under government pressure years ago. Perm 36, blacklisted. Memorial, dissolved. By January, its director, Roman Romanov, was dismissed and replaced with a Kremlin-loyal manager, Anna Trakova. That is reported in The Art newspaper. Wall texts on Stalinist terror were literally removed. There is no section on repression, she's reported as saying. Well, perhaps there never was, despite whatever your memory may tell you. Again, reported by The Art newspaper. Now a sanitized exhibit will replace it. History cleansed, context erased. Because who really wants awkward exhibits about torture and terror? History is traumatic. Everyone knows that. What's the point of memorializing it? Let's just forget it, then erase it. And another example, the Far North Museum, fading over time. The struggle isn't just in Moscow. In Russia's far north, on the grim shores of Solovki, stands another memorial, a former Gulag camp turned museum since 1989. This according to Wikipedia. Solovki was called the mother of the Gulag, where inaugural forced labor and clandestine repression began. But even there, closure looms. The Orthodox Church now has repossessed the monastery, and by 2018, the Gulag section was shut locally. That's from Wikipedia. It is ironic that it was on Solovki that memory of the Gulag first spread, and where Russia's conscience, the physicist and dissident Andrei Sakharov, was incarcerated. Today it's being erased, just like the museum walls in Moscow. So how much worse will this get? What are the implications for Russians that remain in the country? So how much further down the rabbit hole of terror and repression can this go? Well, firstly, expanded repression with 13,000 tried under the wartime laws. The FSB's return to detention control is ominous, according to Project. Number two, memory control, removing the word mass from official repression narratives talking about the terror. Museum text vanishing. Stalin's regime is recast as a heroic era, says The Guardian. Three, public consequence. Citizens will live in a state where history is a sanctioned fairy tale, dissent prescribed by law, and evidence is the preserve of a paranoid few liberals. Resistance amid the impression. But there is some resistance amid the repression. What does this mean? But history isn't entirely dead yet. Some dissidents are still speaking. Alexander Skobov, a veteran Soviet dissident, was sentenced to 16 years in March 2025 for anti-war process. For anti-war posts, he responded, I accuse the stinking corpse of a regime of political terror in Russia. This was reproduced in The Guardian. He is clear-eyed that present repression surpasses even the Soviet era. Meanwhile, Vladimir Karamazov survived poisonings and imprisonment and warns there are more political prisoners in Russia today than there were in the whole of the Soviet Union in the mid-1980s. That was reported in The Guardian. So who are these new prisoners of the Gulag from Navalny to today? We come now to the children of the new Gulag, real people, real names, real families, tossed into Putin's prisons for speaking out. Let's begin with Alexei Navalny, who was tortured and killed by this incarceration and by extension the regime ruling Russia. Navalny's story is known by many. Poisoned with Novichok in 2020, he accused the Kremlin directly. He returned to Russia in January 21, was immediately arrested, labeling him as a criminal, sentenced to 2.5 years for parole violations, then an additional 9 years for fraud and contempt. Navalny described the prison he was incarcerated in as a real concentration camp, reported in Al Jazeera. In February 24, he died in a remote Arctic prison. Official reports citing that he was out walking. Of course, Of course, his supporters suspect foul play. In any case, the conditions under which he was kept make the regime culpable for his death. From his prison diaries in October 24, published in the New York, he says, "They now say openly, we are afraid of you. We are afraid of what you will say. This is the most powerful weapon against this regime of liars, thieves, and hypocrites." Unfortunately, this kind of resistance has not toppled the regime or really even made a dent in it. He warns that his sentencing was a warning aimed at chilling resistance. And there are others in Navalny's circle who have been persecuted, whatever you may think of their political stances. They are certainly being targeted by the regime. His three lawyers, Igor Sergunin, Alexei Lipster, and Vadim Kobzev, received 3.5 to 5.5 years in penal colonies in January 2025, convicted of extremist activity for continuing Navalny's legal work. Four journalists linked to Navalny's Fabakar were sentenced in April 25 to 5.5 years each for extremism after violent rounds of courtroom proclamation. After many violent rounds of courtroom proclamations, independent journalism is equated to extremism now. That's reported in Reuters. And other dissidents have been jailed, some in absentia. Leonid Volkov, Navalny's top aide, was sentenced in absentia to 18 years in June 25, accused of fake news and terrorism. Alexander Skorbov, Soviet dissident, as we've mentioned, received a staggering 16-year sentence for justifying terrorism over condemning Russia's terroristic invasion of Ukraine. Ilya Yashin, a vocal critic, got 8.5 years in December 22 for spreading false information about Bucha and was freed in August 24 for a prisoner swap, but declared persona non grata thereafter. Alexei Gorinov, a Moscow councillor, got 7 plus 3 years in prison for speaking truth about the war and calling the state terror criminal. And of course, Vladimir Karamazov, who survived poisonings and helped expose Kremlin crimes, was sentenced in April 23 to 25 years, the harshest yet for an opposition figure. And he did carry on trying to write columns from prison and was later exchanged in August 24 and released. As I say, some of these have now been released, and we don't necessarily agree with everything they say and do or their political stance. Now they have attained their freedom once more, but their imprisonment is still symbolic of the harsh authoritarian slide in Russia under late-stage Putinism. Today's Gulag is digitized, legalistically enforced, but still cruelly real, and the infrastructure of a punitive dictatorial state is growing. It's a Kafkaesque labyrinth of courts, and closed-door verdicts make a mockery of due process and rule of law. In this episode, we charted the dire trajectory from creeping authoritarianism since 2012, accelerated by the war, to the erasure of historical memory, and now to living victims. Putin's regime has become a collective crime against memory and conscience, law and freedom. We must ramp up the documentation of those crimes, the international pressure on that regime, and in some senses support for political prisoners as well, irrespective of whether we believe necessarily in their political stances or not. But we must also help Ukraine win in its struggle against Russia as the only realistic route for pushing back against Putin's regime at present, and probably the only route to trigger change in Russia itself. And authoritarianism didn't start with the war against Ukraine. Its roots began long ago, but the war has turbocharged this repression. Museums like the Gulag Museum and Solovki were the last defensive lines. Now they are vanishing or gone. Law by decree, memory erasure, FSB prisons. This is no mere authoritarian tweak. It's a full slide to dictatorship. It's a societal purge. If history dies at the stroke of a pen, the future is just a dictatorship with no checks and balances and no end in sight. A Kremlin boot stamping on the face of humanity forever.